Um, Again, welcome everybody for tonight's webinar on how much affordable housing do we need and what is our town's fair share. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Jocelyn Eyre, Community and Economic Development Director for the Northwest Hills Council of Governments. And as many of you know, we're assisting 9 towns currently in the region with affordable housing plan processes. And as part of that, we are having this webinar series on some topics and questions that come up for many of our towns along the way. In a minute, I'm going to introduce you to Sam Griffin, who is our presenter tonight. And Sam is the policy and data analyst for Open Communities Alliance, which is based in Hartford. And they've been working for a while on a fair share housing model for Connecticut and recently released a study that Sam will summarize for us tonight. But before he starts, I just very quickly wanted to note that at the Northwest Hills COG are just really want to bring this information to our towns as a point of discussion, since there is a bill in the legislature now that is being proposed that's sort of based on this study. But we are not at this time endorsing or recommending the fair share housing allocation. We really want to discuss this with our towns and get their input on this, which is really part of the reason for tonight's presentation. So you all have the information and we can have that discussion around this fair share housing model. So I just wanted to sort of make that clear. Again, without, a couple just quick, again, Zoom general announcements, which I'm sorry, we just have to do, unfortunately, at the beginning of all of these, to prevent disruptions from, Zoom bombers, which we've seen a lot of lately. We have basically muted everyone and, not allowed anyone except for the host to share their screen. Sam's going to do a presentation and we will take questions afterwards, and you will be able to either raise your hand and or tap, at any point you can put questions in the chat box. They'll come to me and I'll keep track of them and make sure that we have time to get to those questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn, and thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for inviting me and for being here tonight to lend me your ears. Just before I get into the presentation, a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. and worked in many different sectors of housing before I was interested in city planning, urban and regional planning. So I pursued a master's degree in urban and regional planning at UC Berkeley and actually studied the fair share system that I'm going to talk about tonight as a student under some of the nation's leading researchers on housing. Then was brought to Connecticut for family reasons a little over a year and a half ago, and I've been working on pretty much the researching it and about it. So I'll get presentation my screen. Jocelyn, can you nod if you can see the presentation view?
Yeah, I can see it. Thanks.
Great. Awesome. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about, well, let me introduce, I guess, Open Communities Alliance, which is a civil rights nonprofit that focuses largely on fair housing issues. We're based in Connecticut, but we operate around the state. We've done a number of legal advocacy actions recently, which you may have heard of, and specifically in Woodbridge, Connecticut, also in Hartford, Connecticut, representing tenants in deplorable housing conditions. But one of the things that I spend most of my time working on is zoning and affordable housing policy, which is something that I, again, studied at in planning school and hoped to bring to fruition in Connecticut when I moved here. So what is fair share housing? Well, I'm referring to many things when I talk about fair share tonight. One thing that I'm referring to is our report, which Jocelyn mentioned, which is on our website at the link that you can see on the screen, which we prepared over the past year, working with David Kinsey, a planner in New Jersey. And the reason we've been working with David Kinsey in New Jersey is because he is the architect of the methodology that is used in New Jersey for the famous Mount Laurel Doctrine, which is widely known among affordable housing advocates, but it is one of the most powerful legal doctrines that has produced affordable housing. You can find there the report that details the methodology for fair share housing, as well as the actual model that is the calculation. And as Jocelyn mentioned as well, this is now currently a proposed bill which has been introduced to the Planning and Zoning Committee. So HB 6287, an act concerning fair share planning and zoning. So I'm talking about all those things. And I guess more globally, I'm talking about the system that enables a state to get every town on board to do some small part and a relative part to their duty. So we looked all over the country for policies that were working to build affordable housing at the state level. Connecticut obviously has one. Massachusetts has one. California has a few. They've been doing a lot of changes recently to it. New Jersey has the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which I mentioned, Maryland. All of these systems have various degrees of success in creating affordable housing. But New Jersey is far and away the most successful and most productive. So we started to look more closely into it. We started to work with nonprofits and planners in New Jersey to see how exactly they had such success there. That said, this was never going to be a copy paste from New Jersey. So we had to make sure that a fair share system for Connecticut is really makes sense for Connecticut. So we had a couple guiding principles. The first, and this really has everything to do with making sure it functions well in Connecticut, but it has to be tied closely to state law. And I am not a lawyer, but everyone else at Open Communities Alliance pretty much is. So they are tremendous help with that aspect. It has to address the history of exclusion and segregation, economic and racial, that we have in this state. Obviously, we have it in all regions in the state, in all regions of the country. But racial and economic exclusion and segregation is not only still with us as strong as ever post 60 years after the civil rights movement, but it is very much against the law. We have a state constitution that forbids segregation and requires that governments take actions to address segregation. Next, we have to obviously use responsible planning metrics. That's why they asked me to get involved, because good planning has to work. It has to work for the environment, it has to work for infrastructure. And last but not least, we wanted to use data that anyone could reproduce. So publicly available vetted and used data that is as recent as possible. So essentially, a fair share system boils down to two processes. The first is determining the regional need for affordable housing. And the second is allocating that regional need and affordable housing units to each town in that region. And I'll go through both of these in detail. But first, let's talk about the need. So calculating the need for affordable housing, there's a broad literature on what affordable housing need is and how to define it. But one that's pretty standard across the country, codified by HUD, is paying more than 30% of your household income towards rent or towards housing costs, gross housing costs, gross rent, or mortgage and utilities. And they actually publish a data set that talks about the extent of housing needs for that's based on census data, but includes both the housing conditions, the income, and the cost, what we call cost burden of households. So a household is considered cost burdened if they're paying more than 30% of their income towards household costs or towards housing costs. Sorry. But we're not actually that concerned about the millionaire paying half their income towards to buy a house that maybe they can or cannot afford. So we only look at the lower income brackets, and I'll show you more specifically what we're talking about. So if you look at all the Connecticut households, about 1.3 million, and then you looked at only those households that are cost burden, so paying more than a third or more than 30% of their income towards housing costs, well, it's a staggering number. It's almost 500,000. Then if you start to look at the lower income group, so HUD defines low income as at or below 80% of the area median income, and area median income basically is another HUD calculation that tries to look at what the average income is in a region. It's not the mathematical median, but it tracks with household size. So the area median income for most of the state is between $80,000 and $100,000 for a family of four. And so when you're talking about income limits, as you decrease in the household size, you also decrease in the area median income. But I use this chart to show that as we look at lower and lower income brackets and higher levels of cost burden, so severely cost burden being defined as a household paying more than half of its income towards housing costs, well, the numbers decrease dramatically. The most extreme level of need, the most dire situation, is still a staggeringly high number. This is 135,000 households in the state who are paying more than half of their income towards housing costs, and that income is less than about $30,000 a year for a family of four. Throughout most of the state, obviously it depends. In Fairfield County, maybe it's $40,000 for a family of four. Either way, that leaves little to nothing for these households and families to spend money on transportation costs, on childcare, on anything else, food. So this is a pretty extreme level of need, and this is a pretty big number of households that meet that definition. That's our base for the need. Obviously, the need is greater than that. We can't only build housing that reaches those households and those individuals. It requires greater subsidy to go to deeper levels of affordability for families that are at lower income levels. And that said, if we build 135,000 units in the state, there will be a reshuffling. There will be market impacts beyond just the households that are able to live into newly constructed affordable housing. So we use that as a baseline also because Connecticut is not in the tradition of building that much housing. And so this is a baseline. We call it a very conservative estimate, but it is still a very large estimate for what Connecticut is used to. So then we divide that need into regions. So we have the statewide need, but we want to calculate it at a regional level. So we actually take the housing affordability data from HUD, and we look at the need at each town. And then we aggregate those towns to the regional council of government level, or in your case, the Northwest Hills Regional Council of Government. And that is because of the state law, the Zoning Enabling Act 8-2, which I'll refer to quite a lot, because the Office of Policy and Management refers directly to regional councils of government for this type of analysis. To rewind a little bit, 8-2 is our state's Zoning Enabling Act. Every state in the country has a Zoning Enabling Act because zoning powers rest with the state. The power to zone, the police power required to create zoning laws, rest with the state. But every state has a Zoning Enabling Act enabling towns to use that power instead of the state. So 8-2 is the law that grants municipalities the power to zone. And 8-2 doesn't simply say that, it says a number of other things, which I'll get into. But one of them is that the planning shall address this type of region. So that's why we use COGS. And so when we break down that 135,000 affordable housing units needed, just as a baseline proxy, this is what we get with the 9 regional councils of government. Now, I wasn't here when they drew the lines around the councils of government boundaries, and I might say that maybe, perhaps, they're not perfect, but they are what they are, and I think they're probably going to stay that way for quite a while. But this is what we've got. We've got a clear pattern of the greatest need occurring in the regions with the greatest populations, with the, really surrounding our cities. So you'll see the capital region surrounding Hartford, South Central surrounding New Haven, and the Western and metropolitan regions surrounding Stamford, Norwalk, Bridgeport, and also the Naugatuck Valley surrounding Waterbury. So you can see that the level of need is obviously greater in those areas with a higher population. You can see the Northwest Hills need is not the lowest, but quite a bit lower considering how many towns are involved, at around 3,500 units of affordable housing needed. So the next step, that was step number 1. This is step number 2. How do we allocate this need? And again, we go back to our guiding principles. We want this to be connected to Connecticut state law. We want it to address the history of exclusion and segregation. We want to use responsible planning, and we want to use publicly available, recent, and vetted data. So we settled on 4 allocation factors that we believe are closely tied to 8-2, the Zoning Enabling Act. 8-2 reads that zoning regulations shall encourage the development of housing opportunities, including opportunities for multifamily dwellings. It's pretty explicit about that. So one allocation factor is the extent to which towns have done that. So we use as a proxy for that the proportion of occupied housing units that are living in multifamily structures. And again, this is also using that region. So when we're allocating that need, we're not comparing Harwinton to Hartford. It is the relative proportion of multifamily for all the towns in the Northwest Hills COG. The second allocation factor is the proportion of households living in poverty relative to the region again. And that is because of the portion of 8-2, which requires zoning regulations to promote housing choice and economic diversity in housing, including housing for both low and moderate income households. Now, again, this isn't a perfect proxy, but the amount of poor people that live in a region is indicative of their ability to live in that region, their ability to afford that location and housing, diverse housing types that are available in that region. So we want to, because of not only our mission or just because it's the right thing to do, but we want to address the history of exclusion and segregation through this method. And the research shows that it's sort of a chicken egg question, but exclusionary practices are positively correlated with the presence of wealthy households. And you can call this self-reinforcing. Perhaps wealthy households are more inclined to exclusion, or exclusion can lead to increased property values and wealth accumulation at the expense of a greater region, or at the expense of opportunities there. So we use median household income. And that's also a really good proxy to talk about something else that we do a lot at OCA, which is talk about opportunity and the amenities, the schools, the infrastructure that towns can offer to households with affordable housing. So median household income is an incredibly good proxy for the school performance in a town. And so addressing exclusion and segregation can also help address some of the disparities, racial and economic, in the school resources that are available to our kids. Finally, the fourth allocation factor is drawing on the existing wealth that is accessible to municipalities. So we use the equalized net grand list, which is essentially taxable assets of all kinds that a town could use to basically to operate. This could be used to fund the entire operation of the town, and ties closely to a town's ability to accommodate low-income and moderate-income households. Those are the four allocation factors: poverty, multifamily, income, and wealth. And this is just a snapshot of how it works. This isn't an actual look at the model. You can see the model; it's online. But this just shows you the factors that are going into it. And this is looking at the Western cog. And as you can see, each of the four factors is spitting out a gross fair share and adjusted fair share. But I knew where I was going tonight, so I did a zoom in of the Northwest Hills cog, and this is again, you can tell that the cog in general is shaded much more lightly than all of the surrounding cogs, and that's because of that initial level of less than 3,500 units of affordable housing need. So in general, just the rules of thumb, greater income and greater wealth and less multifamily and less poverty will lead to a higher, relative to your region, will lead to a higher municipal fair share. And this is just the state. You can almost see the boundaries of the, well, you can pretty clearly see the boundaries of the Northwest Hills cog. But again, this is just showing that town by town, you're seeing that regional allocation distributed to towns within those regions. So the Western cog, the metropolitan cog, the South Central and the Capital Region cogs have the bulk of the fair share need. So I know you all heard at the last session about a number of ways to finance affordable housing. I think the most unique piece of how this works compared to other laws and systems that other states use is that it puts towns in the driver's seat. Basically, this methodology assigns a need and provides some guidelines. But there are many, many ways that towns can go about doing it, going out accomplishing their fair share. So we could talk about all of these, but I do want to just bring up that not only are there programs to engage subsidized housing, but there are also big policies. I guess one that you've probably heard of is mixed income, inclusionary zoning, but also just broad zoning changes, or very narrow zoning changes. What's interesting in New Jersey is that the fair share plans that every town creates, they actually identify specific parcels with their targeted incomes, their number of bedrooms, and the exact finance means that they're going to get for those parcels to they bring that to the table, and that's how they accomplish their fair share. There are other ways, obviously, that can induce that, like zoning overlays that encourage mixed income, that require inclusionary set-asides, or fee in lieu and housing trust funds. There are so many ways. There are more ways probably today than there were yesterday. There are innovative financial solutions, and there are financial institutions that are very excited about investing in housing in general and affordable housing. We were talking to a bank in Boston the other day, and I'm not a finance guy, but apparently multifamily housing is the most stable asset on the planet. It is the most financially safe asset class. So I guess I can see why, because we know we're going to need it in the future. Some of this will also involve changes to documents like the zoning regulations, the plan of conservation and development, perhaps, if towns so choose to use that method to get to their fair share. And then, I mean, some towns may require sewer and transportation infrastructure upgrades. But again, what has happened in New Jersey is that every town creates its own plan. A town has an opportunity to argue that its plan, or that its initial fair share calculation is actually infeasible given the current circumstances, get an extension or a reduction in their fair share. But 350 of New Jersey's 400 some towns have created a fair share plan, and they're on track to produce about 100,000 units of affordable housing, which is really remarkable and really outstanding, looking at the track records of even a state like California. So I want to leave time for questions, but I also want to talk a little bit about the economic impacts of what this policy could mean. And again, I'll refer to New Jersey. The New Jersey experience, they were able to fund a lot of these with many of the housing subsidies that I showed on the previous slide. They use state subsidies, housing trust funds, but you'll see that 28% of their affordable housing units were actually accomplished using market rate, mixed income, inclusionary, or fee in lieu, set-asides, et cetera. But basically, with the current level of housing subsidy in the state, some amount of the fair share is going to have to be accomplished by market rate inclusionary. And that, again, is a thing that's up to the town. Some towns have opted in New Jersey for a 20% set aside because these are very high hot market towns that can afford to build, that there's a lot of pent up demand for multifamily housing at very high rent. And a lot of towns will opt to, for a lower percentage or density bonuses. These are all things that there could be books written about, but and there probably are. I think the beauty of it, and the reason that we've actually gotten some support, is because this isn't dictated from Hartford. We're essentially saying, we have this understanding of your need, and we want you to get there. So here you go. But broadly, the impacts will fall into a few different categories. There's the initial economic gains from the construction, the production. That means the jobs that are the construction jobs, the spending that people with those incomes will be doing. Then there's the local supply chain, and a large percentage of the construction materials will be coming from Connecticut companies. So this reverberates out into the Connecticut economy. And then there's also the hyper-specific permit and impact fees. But there are also recurring annual economic gains. So the property taxes, the vast majority of this, I mean, unless it's produced by a housing authority, which, you know, very, very small amount of housing is, especially this market rate is going to bring in dividends in terms of property taxes. Not only that, but all those market rate units are going to be occupied by high income earners who are going to be paying other taxes. They're going to be spending money in the local economy and paying sales taxes, et cetera. So you can see how the economic impact of construction reverberates throughout the economy. So we just did a estimate of taking that 135,000 affordable units with a rough estimate of 162,000 market rate units that would be produced under a fair share system, and just did a little extrapolation based on a National Association of Home Builders study about multifamily housing in Connecticut, which was done in 2019. And in 10 years, this level of construction would lead to almost $60 billion in income for Connecticut residents and $12 billion in state and local tax revenue. Those are Bs. And not only that, but I mean, 80,000 jobs, and that's, you know, they won't all be full-time jobs for 8 years. Some of them will be more construction jobs that are temporary. Some will be longer term part-time jobs related to the management. But that is an estimate, basically 80,000 full-time equivalents that lasts 10 years. And then of course, we haven't even talked about the economic impacts of the affordable housing, but the Connecticut Housing Finance Agency or Authority has estimated that they produce about basically one job per unit that they finance. And they have a number of different finance methods. They do down payment assistance. They do the low income housing tax credit. They have a pretty big statewide housing portfolio. And then 1.26 occupants in each of these housing units are employed. So that is, again, another boon for the economy from these affordable units. Those aren't even in the previous calculation. And this is a part that we don't get to talk about enough because we're always talking to municipalities about people moving there. But the people that move there will benefit immensely. And we can put numbers to that too. Raj Chetty, a Harvard economist, has estimated that the lifetime financial gains from a child moving from a low opportunity to a high opportunity neighborhood is about $300,000. And, you know, we're talking about decreased use of government assistance. We're talking about just improvement in quality of life. But if you want to put it in cold hard numbers, that's $1.6 billion in state income tax revenue. And then there are some macroeconomic impacts, which are very difficult to quantify, but they're no less important. In fact, they may be more important. Connecticut is in a bit of a sticky situation where we haven't built a lot of housing for decades, and our economy has stagnated for decades. Again, it's a kind of a chicken egg situation. Have we stagnated because we haven't produced housing, or have we not produced housing because we've stagnated? Regardless, we know that there's a way out, and it involves growth and it involves housing construction. We have an outmigration of some of the brightest minds, people who come to Connecticut for the excellent school system, and leave with their excellent education to another state, perhaps one with more density or more affordable housing, actually. Some of this is on a regional basis. So if you look at, for example, West Hartford and Hartford, just to use a very striking example, West Hartford is experiencing a jobs boom. And many people who are working those jobs because any business requires a diversity of levels of educational attainment of wage earners. A lot of those workers live in Hartford, and a lot of those workers in Hartford can't afford to live in West Hartford. So not only does it create more congestion, but it also means that if you're talking about starting a business one town further over in Avon, you actually don't have enough of a diverse workforce to start a business. You don't start that business in Avon, and you might go to a more economically dynamic region, perhaps in another state. And again, this is the last point about the anti-competitive market imbalance. That really goes to the impacts on those least fortunate in this situation. The purple dots on the map that you can see are subsidized housing units. Subsidized housing has basically been restricted almost entirely to areas that have been poor and have concentrated poverty. So we've seen cases like the one that we just filed in Hartford about a slumlord who operated with a contract from the city for basically to offer egregious housing conditions for hundreds of tenants. And I mean, it's really awful, the situation that these folks were in. There was nowhere else for them to go. And that's because there's this regional ban, essentially, on affordable housing, except for these neighborhoods. So if we reverse that, if we start forcing these slumlords to compete with other forms of affordable housing elsewhere, perhaps in high opportunities school districts, then they'll have to actually offer a more reasonable product in terms of housing to the folks that are currently not being served by them. So we are, in an effort to sort of just make this catchy, we like to say that fair share is not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. And smart people who have done research on this have shown that in-migration and housing construction together explain about 30% of local economic growth. So the bottom line is that more housing today means more jobs tomorrow. And that's the presentation that I came to give today. And I want to leave a lot of time for questions. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Sam. All right, I'm gonna first start with Julie, who sent her question earlier today. Julie, I'm gonna ask you to unmute yourself. That's okay.
Sure. And I sent you an amendment because as I was listening to this presentation, I'm like, oh, I have to amend my question. You mentioned median household income as one of the inputs. And in the Northwest corner, we have this phenomenon where our median household income isn't truly representative of the people that live here year-round, full-time, because we have so many second homeowners. How can you weight or adjust the model for our region given that metric?
That's a really good question. And any model that is statewide that attempts to be objective is going to have proxies and assumptions that don't fully fit to every town, to every instance. However, that's part of the beauty of the regional method. So we're only comparing each town in this region to each other. So, they're all probably to some degree impacted by that phenomenon. And so when we're comparing them to each other, if we were comparing them to, New London, which doesn't suffer from that phenomenon potentially, then it would be a bigger skew in the model. But I think because we're operating only within regions, comparing towns within regions to each other, I think that hopefully resolves some of the discrepancy.
All right, and we have a question from Daly. I'll unmute you and let you ask your question.
Aha. Thanks, Ben. All right. So nice to meet you, Sam. We have an issue in Falls Village, one of the tiniest communities, but you are tonight talking to Falls Village, Cornwall, and I think Barkhamsted. That's basically the community that's come together tonight. And we have very limited resources here. We have so few jobs. We have zero public transportation. And there have been incentive housing zones proposed. And I would like to hear what you think about using the incentive housing zone, particularly in remote parts of even our tiny communities, for developing housing where we have no jobs, no mass transit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the interesting thing about the incentive housing zone is that it hasn't really been adopted very broadly. I think it perhaps is, and I don't want to disparage it. I know who wrote it, who created it, and I think it's a really good idea. I don't think towns have run with it. I think there's more potential in giving towns the freedom to choose from a much more diverse array of solutions that work for themselves, but really giving the only guide rail being, this is the need, this is the critical need. We're not making up these numbers. These are people that are currently in a very dire situation. And we're just using a rough estimate, or sorry, a very conservative estimate of the need for affordable housing. So we're entrusting towns to figure out and use their creativity to reach those numbers. But those numbers are larger than a lot of towns will want to see, I think.
And I'll just add, because I know Sam isn't working every day with the local employers in our region in the ways that we are through our economic development work, but we are hearing every day from banks, grocery stores, manufacturing companies, schools, restaurants, retirement homes, hospitals, that they have jobs open in our region that go unfilled, in part because we don't have housing that is affordable to the people who either currently work there or who they would like to attract to those jobs. So I think, again, anybody who wants to check it out, we do have a jobs hub on discoverlichfieldhills.com that shows you all the jobs that are open today in our region. So there are plenty of jobs that, again, many of which are going unfilled because what we hear from employers is that the housing isn't available for their employees. So, all right. And also, just so you know, there are a few other communities on the call tonight as well, including Morris and Salisbury and Norfolk and Goshen. Those are the ones I see right now, Sharon. So does anyone else have questions for Sam around the fair share model? Oh, Felicia, all right, go ahead.
Well, my question was, is this data making its way to higher levels within our government so that some of the processes to get affordable housing built might speed up. I mean, you know, I see a lot of familiar faces here from the Regional Housing Council and people who have spent 10 years or more, you know, working on affordable housing in Kent and Cornwall and so on. And I think we all know that we're kind of in a crisis situation right now. You know, yesterday and the day before, I got calls from families in town that are having the houses sold out from under them, they're renters. And there's really no place for them to go. And both these families have kids in schools and do have jobs in this area. You know, they're not doctors and lawyers, but they're construction workers and work at Lime Rock and so on. So, you know, how do we have this data out there and we know that we need to create our fair share. How do we expedite this? How do we make this happen quicker before some of these young people leave the area? Which is not their first wish. You know, they'd like to stay here where their friends and family and jobs are.
Yeah, well, there's a two-part answer. And there's some hope coming from the federal government and the state government potentially. But I am under no impression that these data are going to convince the state government to put forth all the investment that's necessary. The good news is there's so much that can be done right now in your town. Because a big part of this, other than the subsidy and the policies and the structures at the state level that can help produce this housing, are the zoning changes and the infrastructure and very simple policies at the local level that can really encourage affordable housing. So there's stuff that can happen at the local level in every town. I'm looking at all 169 zoning ordinances and looking at ways that they can more closely abide by those state requirements to zone for different housing opportunities for low and moderate income people. So there's a lot of potential there.
All right, can I come back to you, Felicia? Because I know Ben has his hand up too. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks. Sam, I wanted to thank you for your presentation. I'm very impressed with the Open Communities Alliance. I'm aware of it through some of your other colleagues as well. I guess my question is, you know, you make a compelling case for it being a win-win with economic pluses, but what do you know, you brought a lawsuit in Wallingford, and it's not because you guys are litigious. I mean, what's your best answer to the kind of visceral NIMBYism that a lot of small towns seem to engender to things like this? What have you found to work, and what have you found not to work?
Well, I think we would like to pursue a legislative solution, and that could basically solve a lot of the issues in a fell swoop. I don't know if that's, going to happen this legislative session. I think one thing that Woodbridge has done is remind people that perhaps their zoning regulations aren't necessarily following the letter of the law, and maybe no one's been paying attention to that, or no one's been enforcing it recently. And so hopefully Woodbridge was somewhat of a wake-up call. I mean, I think it was certainly a wake-up call to them, and I think other towns are taking notice that, we don't want to sue every town in Connecticut. Certainly we could not. But this is a great example of what towns have been basically allowed to do for decades, if not centuries in some cases, or a century in some cases, as in the case of Woodbridge.
Sorry, could you just explain, just for people that aren't familiar with the Woodbridge scenario, what's going on there with that?
Yeah. Right. So again, you can check out our website. It's our Open Woodbridge page, and we have basically just submitted a very simple text change amendment to the town of Woodbridge, which currently does not allow any multifamily housing. And I think, as I've made clear just in the presentation tonight, the Zoning Enabling Act requires towns to zone for multifamily housing. And so we've basically asked them with this text amendment to change their zoning in a way that would allow us to build, and we have a prototypical build with a developer of on a lot that is currently occupied by a single family home. And we would make 4 units, 2 of them, which would be affordable. And so it's an example of something that is as unobtrusive, as beautiful as you wouldn't even notice it, type of affordable housing as possible, in an effort to say, this is just one small thing you can do, and you'll be more in line with the legal mandates that do exist.
Thanks. Felicia, did you have another question?
It was kind of building on what Ben was saying, is that, you know, one of our challenges are within our community. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding regarding affordable housing, and, you know, it actually is more like middle income housing, right? So, but because of the name, it seems to, you know, ignite fear and hostility in communities. A lot of these smaller communities, you know, don't have multi-family housing. So, you know, that is not something that they embrace. So, you know, how are some ways that we can help educate our communities and even our planning and zonings, so that, you know, the multifamily housing, as you said, which is by law, is not fought at a planning and zoning and community level. I mean, it just bogs things down. If you are working on building affordable housing, it can add another year to your process, just going through, you know.
Absolutely. So we are a coalition, not just in name, but we have coalition members. So one way to start getting involved is through our coalition. We have just started a program called Coalition Town Ambassadors. So we have 1 to 2 people in about 15 towns in the state right now, who are basically ambassadors of Open Communities Alliance to their towns, doing organizing around issues of exclusionary zoning, of obstacles to affordable housing. And we empower them with, you know, whatever research helps them overcome those arguments that you often hear, and they're generally you know, not really about what they are supposed to be about. Often the arguments you hear are going to be coded, but essentially saying we don't want those people here. And there's a lot there. I mean, so we respond in multiple ways. I think one important way is to talk about the history, the really sordid history of racial segregation, inequality that has led to the current wealth gap that is in the state. And the other way is to just address the facts with facts. There's evidence that affordable housing, well-designed affordable housing that fits in with the community, actually increases nearby property values. And read The Color of Law, says Julia. That's also a good place to start. But yeah, please check out our website, ctoca.org. Sign up for our coalition and our newsletters. And we're right in the thick of it right now. I mean, there's some potential to make change at the legislature this year. And if not this year, then we'll keep doing this for as long as it takes.
All right, we got a couple more questions. One from Mary. Mary, I think you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering, do you have any, fairly current information available on how affordable housing impacts local property values? The research I've done shows that it has no impact, or depending on the exact location, it can actually increase values. And I know a lot of people are afraid that will cause, a decrease in values. So I'd love to get some, current data on that.
Yeah, this is something that we obviously engage with at every single town that we work in. That is one of the, it's almost like we could write the rebuttal to our affordable housing plan and then just hand it to them to tell us. But you're right on, and I mean that's what the research says that I'm looking at anyway. That there's been research as recent as 2019, I believe, studying the positive impact of multifamily affordable housing on adjacent single-family property values. So it doesn't really get any more clear than that. I think there's an attempt to engender fear of affordable housing, and I don't try to armchair psychoanalyze folks or communities, but often there are very loud voices that don't represent the community. So town halls can be full of very loud voices in opposition. And as we've seen, if you've been following the Woodbridge events, the vast majority of people who spoke were speaking in support at the public meetings. And I think it just goes to show, I mean, part of it is a phenomenon of people who generally support affordable housing don't support it enough to go to the public hall, go to the town hall meetings, go to the P&Z meetings and testify. But the people who oppose it, they're definitely willing to go. So I think partly we need to change that balance. And if you do care about these issues, be that person and show up and show that it is not a majority opinion that towns don't need affordable housing.
Sam, if you have a link to that study from 2019, I can send it on to Mary as well.
Absolutely.
All right, and there's a question from Toby. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So my name's Toby. I'm a resident in Cornwall, Connecticut, and I'm one of the New Yorkers who was here mostly on weekends and have been living here more year-round now this year. But I've been coming here for 25 years routinely, and I'm an architect working in affordable housing in New York City full-time. And one of the things I've noticed in our town in Cornwall is there's definitely interest and broad support, I think, for housing at different income levels, and people see it through their college-age kids wanting to settle here, their senior citizen parents wanting to downsize their homes. But there's pretty uniform fear of changing the landscape and sort of quote-unquote ruining or not respecting the historic building stock here. And I'm wondering, Sam, in your work across the state, I know that there are a lot of abandoned mills. There's a lot of historic infrastructure and building stock that's not the cheapest way to build affordable housing because it requires often environmental remediation and utility hookups and things like that. But I'm wondering if you've discovered any good tools for helping towns like Cornwall, which doesn't have any historic districts, doesn't have a very robust way of doing site planning and site analysis, and yet people over and over say, we love the landscape, we love the rural character, we don't want to do anything to destroy that. That's what makes this place great. But do you have some good tools for kind of shoehorning in different types of housing in ways that continue to keep those special things and also help people figure out a way to sort of better protect them, but at the same time facilitate more development, but in a more concentrated, more thoughtful way?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the answer is in your question. More concentrated, more thoughtful. I think when we we engage a lot with environmental groups around the state, and there is a very understandable concern that just more housing period is going to damage the environment. But what the result becomes is that we only build sprawl single family homes across and gobble up more and more land. And so the most efficient way to produce more housing is where it makes the most sense to, which is often where it already is. And it often means building it higher. So that's often not what planning and zoning commissions want to hear, but you're doing the environment no service by extending the streets and into greenfill development areas when you could be doing it and by simply creating more density where housing exists now. So I don't know if that really answered your question. I think part of it was resources for towns. And I know that there are lots of state agencies that offer grants for kind of the planning and the infrastructure analysis that you might need to do. There are conservancy groups that would probably be really useful and helpful. So I think where there's a will, there's a way. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, forgive me.
And I'll also note again that one of the other great things we have in this region is a lot of small towns who have small nonprofit local organizations that are building affordable housing in our towns and doing it. They live there and they're doing it in a way that, again, respects the rural environment of our towns. So, we have, I think, 13 of those nonprofit affordable housing organizations in our region that are doing this. And, some projects I can think of off the top of my head. I think Julie's still here in Norfolk. They were able to have a few buildings actually donated to them in the town center and were able to put those units together into one project and get financing to rehab them and in a way that the State Historic Preservation Office approved of, which again took a long time, but they were able to do that. The Northwest Connecticut Regional Housing Council, which is made up of those local nonprofit groups, does get together 4 times a year and shares information and resources around basically how to get this done in small towns, again, where everyone's very sensitive to, that balance of making sure that you are protecting everything that all of our residents love about our towns while also providing housing options for residents. So I think that is all, and I do want to make sure that we leave at a reasonable time. But again, I want to thank Sam for being here and presenting to us. And if there are follow-up questions, you can feel free to email me, and I'll also get them on to Sam. I do think that the next steps in the process for many of our towns are to think about those solutions and strategies that will work for your individual town. And so that's kind of the next step in the housing plan process. But thank you, Sam, for your presentation tonight, and thank all of you for coming and participating in the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to all of you tonight. I'll see you again.
All right, thanks. Good night, everybody.